September 12, 1944. The autumn sun hung low over the Alberta prairie, casting long shadows across fields of golden wheat ready for harvest. In small farming communities scattered across rural Canada, families were preparing for the most critical weeks of their agricultural year. But for the Pritchard family near the town of Lethbridge, this harvest season would bring something far more unexpected than early frost or equipment breakdowns. It would bring the enemy to their doorstep. Henry Pritchard stood in his farmyard that morning, reading a letter from the Canadian Department of National Defense with growing disbelief. His weathered hands, calloused from decades of working the land, trembled slightly as he absorbed the words. The government was implementing a new prisoner of war labor program. German prisoners, captured in Europe as Allied forces advanced, would be assigned to Canadian farms facing critical labor shortages. But unlike the male prisoners already working in lumber camps and construction projects across the country, this letter informed him that he would be receiving female prisoners, members of the German Women's Auxiliary Corps, captured during recent operations in France. Mabel Pritchard watched her husband from the kitchen window, noting the unusual stillness in his posture. In their 23 years of marriage, she had learned to read his silhouettes against the prairie sky. This was not the stance of a man dealing with ordinary farm business. When he finally came inside, the letter clutched in his work-roughened hand, she saw something in his face she rarely witnessed: uncertainty bordering on fear. "They're sending us Germans," he said quietly, glancing toward the sitting room where their 3 children were occupied with afternoon chores and homework. 5 women prisoners to help with the harvest. They'll be housed in the old bunkhouse and guarded by a military detail. Mabel felt her breath catch. Like every Canadian family, the Pritchards had followed the war news with a mixture of pride in their country's contribution and anxiety about the cost. They knew families in town who had lost sons at Dieppe, fathers who hadn't returned from the Great War a generation earlier. The very word German carried weight in their household, associated with distant battlefields and incomprehensible atrocities reported in weekly newspapers. "What kind of women?" Mabel asked, her practical nature asserting itself even as her mind reeled with implications. Henry scanned the letter again. Auxiliary Corps members. Not soldiers exactly, but they served the Wehrmacht in various capacities: radio operators, nurses, administrative personnel, young women mostly. The letter says they'll arrive within the week under military escort. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, listening to the ordinary sounds of their children's voices drifting from the other room. 16-year-old Duncan was helping 12-year-old Pearl with her arithmetic, while 8-year-old Louis played with wooden soldiers on the braided rug their grandmother had made. The innocence of those sounds stood in stark contrast to the reality descending upon their peaceful farm. Outside, the wheat continued its patient wait for harvest, golden and heavy with grain, indifferent to the complicated human dramas about to unfold in its shadow. The transport truck arrived on September 19, 1944, raising a cloud of dust that hung in the still prairie air like a curtain between two worlds. Annalise Hartman sat rigid in the back of the military vehicle, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gray auxiliary uniform dusty and worn from weeks of transit. Beside her, 4 other German women maintained similar postures of tense dignity, their faces masks of controlled apprehension. At 24 years old, Annalise had served as a communications officer in occupied France, believing she was contributing to her country's defense. Now, after capture by Canadian forces and a disorienting journey across the Atlantic, she found herself being delivered to a farm in a country she had been taught to view as an enemy territory. The landscape outside the truck's canvas covering looked nothing like the ravaged European countryside she had left behind. Here, fields stretched endlessly beneath an impossibly vast sky, unmarred by bomb craters or the scorched remnants of conflict. Captain Arnold Weatherby rode in the cab of the truck, reviewing his orders with growing unease. He had supervised male prisoner work details before, but this assignment felt different. The 5 women in his charge were not hardened soldiers. They were young, frightened, and facing an uncertain future in a foreign land. His instructions were clear: maintain security, ensure the prisoners followed camp protocols, and oversee their labor assignments. But nowhere in his official orders did it explain how to manage the human complexity of placing enemy women in the care of a farming family. When the truck finally stopped in the Pritchard farmyard, a moment of absolute silence fell. Annalisa could hear her own heartbeat, could sense the tension radiating from her companions. 22-year-old Brigitte Schroeder, who had served as a nurse, gripped the edge of the wooden bench so tightly her knuckles had turned white. 27-year-old Dorothea Muller, an administrative clerk, kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to show any emotion that might be interpreted as weakness. The canvas flap opened, and Captain Weatherby gestured for them to exit. One by one, the 5 women climbed down from the truck, their movements stiff from hours of travel. They formed an instinctive line, military training asserting itself even in these strange circumstances. Annalisa stood at the front, her posture straight despite exhaustion, her blue eyes taking in her surroundings with careful assessment. The Pritchard family stood on their farmhouse porch, a tableau of uncertainty matching the prisoner's own apprehension. Henry held his hat in his hands, turning it slowly. Mabel stood beside him, her apron still dusted with flour from the bread she had been making when the truck arrived. The children clustered behind their parents, curiosity and caution warring in their young faces. Neither group moved. The distance between the porch and the truck might have been measured in yards, but it felt like an unbridgeable chasm separating 2 worlds that had no common language for this moment. The first 72 hours passed in careful, choreographed distance. The German women were housed in the old bunkhouse that Henry had hastily cleaned and furnished with 5 simple cots. Corporal Vernon Shaw, a young guard from Saskatchewan, maintained watch from a small tent pitched near the building. The women rose at dawn, were escorted to the fields, worked under supervision, and returned to their quarters at sunset. They spoke only to each other in quiet German, their conversations too low for their guards to hear. Annalisa observed everything with the trained eye of someone who had learned to gather intelligence from small details. The Pritchard farm was prosperous but not wealthy, well-maintained through obvious hard work rather than hired help. The family ate together at a large kitchen table, visible through windows that faced the bunkhouse. The children laughed frequently. Mabel moved through her daily routines with efficient grace. Henry worked alongside his prisoners in the fields, demonstrating tasks without unnecessary words, his weathered face revealing neither hostility nor friendship. On the evening of the 3rd day, as the women returned from harvesting, they found something unexpected waiting outside their bunkhouse. A wooden table had been set up, covered with a clean white cloth. On it sat 5 plates, each filled with food still steaming in the cooling evening air. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, fresh green beans, thick slices of bread with butter, and slices of apple pie. The women stopped, staring at the abundance with incomprehension. Their official rations were adequate but basic, distributed by Corporal Shaw according to military protocols. This was something entirely different. This was a family meal, served with care on real plates with cloth napkins folded beside each setting. Mabel Pritchard emerged from her kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She walked toward the women with neither hesitation nor excessive warmth, simply moving with the same practical purpose she brought to all her tasks. In accented but understandable English, Annalisa spoke carefully. "We have rations, Mrs. Pritchard. This is not necessary." Mabel's response was direct, her prairie pragmatism cutting through the complicated politics of the situation. "I cooked supper for my family. I made extra. Seemed foolish to let it go to waste when there are people who could eat it." She paused, her eyes meeting Annalisa's with unexpected directness. "It's still warm. Best eat it before it gets cold." She turned and walked back to her house, leaving the 5 German women standing before a meal that challenged everything they had expected about their captivity. Brigitte was the first to move, drawn by the unfamiliar scent of properly seasoned food. The others followed slowly, taking seats at the table with cautious reverence. That night, Anneliese wrote in the small diary she had managed to keep through her capture and journey. The entry was brief, but marked the beginning of something none of them yet understood. Today, the enemy fed us from her own table. Mabel Pritchard had not made her decision lightly. For 3 days, she had watched the German women through her kitchen window as they worked in the fields, noting details that her husband might have missed. She saw how Brigitte favored her left leg slightly, probably from an old injury. She noticed that Dorothea organized the other women with quiet efficiency, arranging their work to maximize productivity without anyone appearing to give orders. She observed how young Irmgard Fischer, only 21, sometimes paused to stare at the horizon with an expression of such profound homesickness that Mabel recognized it immediately. Most significantly, she saw their hunger, not the simple appetite of people ready for their next meal, but the deeper hunger of bodies that had known genuine scarcity. When Corporal Shaw distributed their rations, the women ate with careful control, making each portion last, savoring every bite with an intensity that spoke of recent deprivation. Mabel had grown up during the lean years following the Great War, when prairie families learned to stretch every resource. She understood hunger as more than physical need. It was a vulnerability, a stripping away of dignity that reduced people to their most basic survival instincts. She had also lost her older brother in that earlier war, killed in the trenches of France by German artillery. The irony of now hosting German women on her farm was not lost on her. Yet, as she watched these young women work her family's fields, she could not sustain the abstract hatred that war demanded. They were not the faceless enemy of newspaper reports and government propaganda. They were tired young women far from home, doing work they had never trained for, facing an uncertain future with whatever dignity they could maintain. On the 4th evening, the pattern repeated. Mabel prepared extra food and set the table outside the bunkhouse. This time she added a pitcher of fresh milk and a jar of her preserved strawberry jam. The women ate in grateful silence, and when they finished, Dorothea approached the farmhouse with the cleaned plates stacked carefully in her arms. Mabel met her at the kitchen door. Through halting English supplemented with hand gestures, Dorothea expressed thanks. Mabel accepted the plates with a simple nod, but then she did something that surprised even herself. She invited Dorothea inside, gesturing to her kitchen table, and poured 2 cups of tea. The 2 women sat across from each other, separated by language and history, but connected by something more fundamental. Mabel showed Dorothea a photograph of her brother, killed 26 years earlier. She did not speak, knowing Dorothea's English was too limited for complex conversation, but she needed this German woman to understand that kindness did not mean forgetting, that feeding someone did not erase the past. Dorothea looked at the photograph for a long moment, then reached into her uniform pocket and withdrew her own photograph. A young man in German uniform, her brother, killed on the Eastern Front 2 years earlier. The 2 women sat in Mabel's warm kitchen, holding photographs of brothers who had died in different wars, recognizing in each other a grief that transcended national boundaries. The evening meals became a ritual that neither side openly acknowledged, but both came to depend upon. Each night, Mabel prepared extra portions and set them outside the bunkhouse. Each night, the German women ate with quiet gratitude, and each night, Dorothea returned the cleaned dishes to the kitchen door. Sometimes Mabel invited her in for tea, sometimes they simply exchanged nods. Words were unnecessary for the understanding developing between them. Anneliese noticed the change in her companions first. Brigitte's shoulders no longer carried the same rigid tension. Waltraud Becker, the 29-year-old supply coordinator who had maintained the most hostile silence, began helping Irmgard with her halting English practice. The women still worked hard in the fields, still maintained their discipline, but something fundamental had shifted in how they inhabited this strange captivity. Henry Pritchard observed these changes with his characteristic quiet attention. He had been skeptical of his wife's feeding program, worried it might complicate the already complex situation, but he could not argue with results. The German women worked more efficiently, took greater care with the equipment, and showed genuine concern for the quality of their harvest work. When a sudden rainstorm threatened freshly cut wheat, they worked alongside him without complaint until well after dark, helping to get the grain under cover. One afternoon in early October, as the harvest reached its critical peak, the old threshing machine broke down. Henry had been nursing the temperamental equipment through one more season, knowing he could not afford replacement during wartime restrictions. When the drive belt snapped, he stood staring at the machine with the particular frustration of a farmer watching precious time slip away. Waltraud approached him cautiously, gesturing at the broken machinery. Before the war, she had worked in her father's agricultural equipment business in Cologne. She had grown up around machines like this, understanding their mechanical logic. Through a combination of limited English, hand gestures, and drawings in the dirt, she communicated that she might be able to repair it. Henry's initial instinct was to refuse. Allowing an enemy prisoner to handle crucial farm equipment seemed to cross some invisible line, but the wheat would not wait for his pride or his uncertainty. He nodded permission and watched as Waltraud examined the machine with expert efficiency. Within 2 hours, using improvised parts and creative solutions, she had the thresher running again. That evening, Mabel set the table as usual, but Henry did something unprecedented. He walked to the bunkhouse himself, carrying an extra chair. When the women gathered for their meal, he sat down with them. The conversation was minimal, limited by language barriers, but his presence communicated what words could not. They were no longer simply prisoners being fed out of Christian charity. They were becoming, however improbably, part of the farm's working community. Corporal Shaw watched from his post, noting the development in his daily report with carefully neutral language. But privately, he wondered what his superiors would make of a situation that seemed to be evolving beyond the standard protocols for prisoner supervision. Pearl Pritchard had been watching the German women with the unfiltered curiosity of a 12-year-old. While her parents maintained careful adult distance and her older brother Duncan affected teenage indifference, Pearl saw only fascinating strangers who spoke a mysterious language and wore unusual clothes. She had been warned to stay away from the bunkhouse, to let the adults handle the complicated business of enemy prisoners. But prohibition had never been particularly effective with Pearl. On a Saturday afternoon in mid-October, while her parents were occupied with weekend tasks, Pearl wandered toward the field where Brigitte was working alone, repairing fence, posts that the harvest equipment had damaged. The young German woman looked up, startled by the child's sudden appearance. Pearl carried a book under her arm and an expression of determined purpose. "Can you read English?" Brigitte asked, her accent thick, but her words clear enough. Pearl had heard the women practicing their language skills in the evenings, their voices carrying across the farmyard. Brigitte nodded slowly, uncertain where this was heading. Pearl thrust the book forward. It was a worn copy of Anne of Green Gables, her favorite story. "I thought you might be lonely," Pearl said simply. "Reading helps when you're lonely." The unexpected kindness struck Brigitte with surprising force. She accepted the book with trembling hands, her eyes suddenly bright with tears she fought to control. In that moment, she was not an enemy prisoner or a representative of a defeated nation. She was simply a 22-year-old woman far from home, being offered friendship by a child who saw past all the complicated labels adults imposed. 8-year-old Louis had his own questions, delivered with the blunt directness of young children. He found Annalisa near the barn one afternoon and asked why she talked funny. Annalisa, amused despite herself, explained that she came from Germany and German was her first language. Lewis considered this information seriously, then asked if German children played the same games as Canadian children. The question opened an unexpected conversation. Anneliese described games from her own childhood in Berlin, finding English words for activities she had not thought about in years. Lewis listened with rapt attention, then insisted on teaching her how to play marbles properly, demonstrating with the intense seriousness children bring to important matters. Duncan, at 16, tried to maintain the suspicious distance he believed appropriate for a young man nearly old enough to enlist. But his resolve weakened when he discovered Irmgard struggling with the mathematics in an English textbook she had found. Despite his determination to remain aloof, his natural instinct to help with schoolwork overcame his political reservations. Soon he was explaining algebraic equations, finding that teaching required him to see Irmgard as a student rather than an enemy. These small interactions, observed by Mabel from her kitchen window, troubled her even as they warmed her heart. Her children were developing relationships with women whose country had killed her brother, whose government had started a war that was still claiming lives across the globe. Yet she could not bring herself to forbid these innocent connections. Perhaps, she thought, this was how peace actually worked, not through treaties and official declarations, but through children who refused to inherit their parents' hatreds. November brought the first serious snowfall to the Alberta prairie, transforming the landscape overnight into a white expanse that seemed to erase all boundaries and distinctions. The harvest was complete, stored safely in the grain elevators in town, and the urgent labor that had justified the prisoners' presence had ended. Captain Weatherby arrived with new orders. The women would be transferred to a permanent internment facility near Medicine Hat, where they would spend the winter with other German prisoners. The announcement created an unexpected heaviness in the Pritchard household. Mabel found herself troubled by feelings she could not easily name. Over the past 2 months, the 5 German women had become part of the farm's daily rhythm. Their voices, speaking German in the bunkhouse, had become as familiar as the sound of wind through the wheat. The idea of the building standing empty, of meals prepared for only her own family, felt like a loss she had not anticipated. Henry was more direct in his concerns. The women had proved themselves invaluable workers, but more than that, they had demonstrated a dedication to the farm that went beyond simple compliance with orders. Waltraud had continued to maintain the equipment, preventing breakdowns that would have cost him dearly. Dorothea had organized the grain storage with a systematic efficiency that impressed him. They had earned something he struggled to articulate, some consideration beyond mere gratitude for labor completed. The children's reactions were more openly emotional. Pearl cried when she learned Bridget would be leaving, having grown attached to the quiet German woman who had read her favorite book and discussed its characters with surprising insight. Lewis declared the situation unfair with the absolute certainty of 8-year-old judgment. Even Duncan, maintaining his teenage reserve, seemed subdued by the news. On the evening before the scheduled transfer, Mabel made a decision that surprised even her husband. She invited all 5 German women into her home for dinner, not as prisoners being fed, but as guests sitting at the family table. Captain Weatherby, consulted about the propriety of such an arrangement, found no specific regulation forbidding it and gave his uncomfortable permission. The dinner was awkward at first, everyone too aware of the historical weight of enemies sharing a meal in genuine hospitality. But Pearl's enthusiastic chatter gradually eased the tension, and Lewis's innocent questions about German Christmas traditions opened conversations that revealed shared humanity beneath national differences. Anneliese, whose English had improved dramatically over the past weeks, found herself describing her family's Christmas celebrations in Berlin, the markets and traditions that seemed impossibly distant from this prairie farmhouse. Brigitte spoke about her work as a nurse before the war. Her dreams of continuing medical training that now seemed foreclosed by her status as a captured enemy national. As the evening progressed, Mabel brought out her precious preserved peaches, a luxury saved for special occasions. The gesture was not lost on the German women, who understood they were being honored beyond their status. When the meal ended, there was a moment of silence as everyone recognized that something significant had occurred, something that could not be easily categorized or explained in official reports. The transfer was postponed by a combination of bureaucratic delays and unseasonably heavy snow that made the roads impassable. The German women remained at the Pritchard farm through late November, a liminal period where their status grew increasingly unclear. They were no longer needed for harvest work, yet they remained under guard in the bunkhouse, waiting for transportation that kept being rescheduled. During this uncertain time, the first letters from Germany arrived through international Red Cross channels. Captain Weatherby delivered them personally, watching the women's faces as they recognized handwriting from home. Anneliese received 3 letters, all written months earlier by her mother in Berlin. She retreated to her bunk to read them in private, grateful for the small dignity of solitude in processing news from a world that felt increasingly unreal. The letters painted a picture of devastation that contradicted everything she had been told during her service. Her mother wrote in careful language, clearly aware that military censors might read her words, but the truth emerged through what was left unsaid. The neighborhood where Anneliese had grown up no longer existed, destroyed in bombing raids. Her father had been killed in an air raid shelter collapse. Her younger sister had been evacuated to relatives in the countryside, her location uncertain. But it was the tone of her mother's letters that struck Anneliese most forcefully. There was no triumphant patriotism, no confident assertions about ultimate victory. Instead, there was exhaustion, grief, and a desperate hope that Anneliese was safe wherever she had been taken. The war that had seemed noble and necessary. When Anneliese joined the Auxiliary Corps appeared in her mother's words as simply catastrophic, a grinding destruction of everything familiar and precious. Brigitte's news was even more devastating. Her family's home in Munich had been completely destroyed. Her parents were living in a church basement with dozens of other displaced families. Her brother, whose photograph she had shown Mabel weeks earlier, had been declared missing on the Eastern Front, his fate unknown. The letter from her mother begged Brigitte to find some way to remain wherever she was, suggesting that returning to Germany might mean returning to nothing. Not all the letters carried such dark news, but all of them revealed a Germany vastly different from the one the women had left. Irmgard learned that her family's bakery had been seized for war production. Dorothea discovered that her fiancé had been killed at Stalingrad. Waltraud's letter reported that her father's equipment business had been bombed, the family fortune reduced to rubble and debt. That evening, the women gathered in the bunkhouse, sharing their news in quiet German conversations that Corporal Shaw could not understand. But he did not need to understand the words to recognize the grief in their voices, the way they comforted each other with gestures that transcended language. Mabel, watching from her kitchen window, saw Anneliese sitting alone outside the bunkhouse despite the cold, staring at the vast prairie ski. Without thinking about protocols or propriety, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, walked across the farmyard, and sat beside the young German woman in wordless solidarity. The letters from Germany created a crisis of understanding that the women struggled to articulate even to each other. For months, they had been processing their capture and imprisonment through frameworks they had been taught. They were soldiers who had been defeated but not dishonored. They were serving a necessary, if painful, period of captivity before returning to resume their lives in a Germany that would eventually recover and rebuild. Now those frameworks were collapsing under the weight of information that contradicted everything they had been told during their service. The Germany described in their families' letters bore no resemblance to the confident, powerful nation they had believed they were defending. The propaganda that had shaped their understanding of the war revealed itself as an elaborate fiction designed to sustain their compliance with a system that had been destroying their own country even as it attacked others. Annalise found herself remembering specific moments from her training and service with new and troubling clarity. The speeches about German superiority and destiny that had seemed inspiring now appeared as dangerous delusions. The casual dismissals of enemy populations as inferior now struck her as preparation for atrocities she had refused to imagine. She had thought herself a patriot serving her nation's defense. Now she wondered if she had been simply a fool, manipulated into supporting something she would have rejected if she had understood its true nature. The Pritchard family's kindness became even more confusing in light of these revelations. By all logic, these Canadians should hate the German women who represented a nation that had brought such suffering to the world. Yet Mabel continued to feed them, Henry continued to treat them with quiet respect, and the children continued to seek their company with innocent friendliness. One evening, as Mabel and Annalisa sat together in the kitchen, a practice that had become increasingly common, Annalise struggled to express her confusion in her imperfect English. "Why are you kind to us? We are your enemies. Our country has done terrible things." Mabel was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. "You're not your country," she finally said. "You're 5 young women who made choices based on what you were told was true. Being kind to you doesn't mean I forget what Germany has done. It means I choose to see you as people, not just as symbols of something bigger." The distinction seemed impossibly subtle to Annalise, yet it offered a framework for understanding that she desperately needed. Perhaps redemption was not about denying what her country had done or her own complicity in serving its systems. Perhaps it was about choosing, going forward, to become someone different than who she had been. Father Brendan McKinnon visited the farm that week, having heard about the German prisoners from Mrs. Edith Caldwell, the school teacher who moved through the community with efficient curiosity. The priest asked to speak with the women, and Captain Weatherby, uncertain about religious protocols in such situations, granted permission. Father McKinnon's conversation with the 5 German women lasted over 2 hours and proved transformative in ways none of them expected. December arrived with bitter cold and the growing certainty that the women would remain at the Pritchard farm through the winter. The permanent internment facility at Medicine Hat was overcrowded, and the authorities had decided that keeping the women in their current productive arrangement made more administrative sense than relocating them. Captain Weatherby delivered this news with carefully neutral language, but everyone understood the implications. What had begun as a temporary work assignment had evolved into something more permanent and more complicated. The approaching Christmas season created its own tensions. For the Pritchard family, Christmas meant traditions carefully preserved across generations, celebrations that affirmed their faith and their community bonds. For the German women, it meant confronting the absence of everything familiar, the impossibility of sharing the holiday with families who existed only in letters that arrived months late. Mabel wrestled with how to handle the situation. She could not invite enemy prisoners to participate fully in her family's Christmas celebrations, yet leaving them isolated in the bunkhouse while her own family celebrated felt cruel in ways that troubled her conscience. She consulted with Father McKinnon, who offered perspective shaped by his own experience ministering to displaced persons and prisoners. The solution they developed was characteristically practical and surprisingly generous. The German women would be allowed to create their own modest Christmas celebration in the bunkhouse, with materials provided by the Pritchard family. They would not join the family's private celebrations, but neither would they be completely excluded from the season's spirit. Pearl took charge of gathering decorations with enthusiastic determination. She enlisted Lewis in cutting pine branches from the trees that bordered the farm's northern property line. Duncan, affecting reluctance but showing genuine care, constructed a small wooden stand that could hold the branches in approximation of a Christmas tree. Mabel contributed candles, precious during wartime rationing, and fabric scraps that could be fashioned into simple ornaments. On Christmas Eve, the Pritchard family attended church services in town, leaving Corporal Shaw to supervise the prisoners. When they returned, they found the bunkhouse transformed. The German women had created decorations from available materials with impressive creativity. Paper snowflakes cut from old newspapers hung from strings. Small figures fashioned from fabric scraps represented nativity scenes. The pine branches, decorated with Mabel's candles and simple ornaments, stood in the corner like a small miracle of determination and hope. But the most striking element was the music. As the Pritchard family approached their own home, they heard singing from the bunkhouse. 5 voices harmonizing in German, the words unfamiliar, but the melodies recognizable. Silent Night, sung in its original language, carried across the snow-covered farmyard with heartbreaking beauty. Mabel stopped walking, held by something she could not name. The music contained all the longing and sorrow of displacement, all the hope and resilience of people refusing to surrender to despair. Henry stood beside her, his weathered face reflecting the complex emotions that their unexpected guests had brought into their lives. January 1945 brought news that shattered what remained of the German women's understanding of their former service. Allied forces advancing into Germany were discovering concentration camps, and reports were beginning to filter back through military channels and newspaper accounts. The revelations were so horrific that many people, including some Allied soldiers, initially refused to believe them. Systematic extermination, industrialized murder, atrocities on a scale that seemed to exceed human comprehension. Captain Weatherby received orders to share these reports with the German prisoners under his supervision, part of a broader denazification effort designed to confront captured Germans with the truth of their regime's actions. He approached the task with visible reluctance, understanding that he was about to destroy whatever remaining illusions these women held about the country they had served. The women gathered in the bunkhouse on a gray afternoon as Weatherby read official reports describing Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, and other camps whose names would become synonymous with unfathomable evil. He read descriptions of gas chambers, mass graves, systematic starvation, medical experiments, and the calculated destruction of entire populations. His voice remained steady through professional discipline, but his hands trembled slightly as he turned pages. Annalisa listened with growing horror, her face draining of color as the full scope of the revelations emerged. These were not enemy propaganda or exaggerated war stories. These were documented facts verified by multiple sources, accompanied by photographs that captured evidence too terrible to dismiss. The Germany she had believed she was serving had never truly existed. Instead, she had been part of a regime that had committed crimes beyond her ability to comprehend. Brigitte ran from the bunkhouse and vomited in the snow, her body rejecting information her mind could not process. Dorothea sat frozen, tears streaming down her face, her careful composure completely shattered. Irmgard whispered prayers in German, seeking comfort from faith that suddenly seemed inadequate to address such profound evil. Waltraud stared at her hands as if seeing them for the first time, wondering what those hands had supported through her work maintaining equipment that had enabled such atrocities. The afternoon dissolved into grief and shock that Captain Weatherby was unprepared to manage. He had expected denial, perhaps anger, possibly defiant justification. Instead, he witnessed complete psychological devastation. As if the women's entire understanding of themselves and their place in the world had been destroyed in the space of an hour. Mabel, observing from her kitchen window, saw Annalisa stumble outside into the January cold without a coat, walking blindly across the snow-covered farmyard. Without conscious decision, Mabel grabbed her own coat and followed, finding the young German woman collapsed in the snow near the barn, sobbing with a grief that seemed bottomless. Mabel knelt beside her, placing her coat around Annalisa's shaking shoulders. She offered no words of comfort, understanding that no words could address what this young woman was experiencing. Instead, she simply stayed, bearing witness to a reckoning that had been inevitable from the moment Annalisa first arrived on the farm. The weeks following the revelations were marked by a grief so profound that normal activities seemed almost obscene in their ordinariness. Yet the farm demanded its routines regardless of human emotional crises. Animals needed feeding, equipment required maintenance, and winter's harsh realities continued without pause for processing devastating news. The German women moved through their days like ghosts, performing tasks with mechanical precision, while their minds struggled to reconcile what they had learned. Annalise found herself unable to sleep, lying awake in her bunk, replaying memories of her service with new and horrifying context. Every order she had followed, every communication she had transmitted, every efficient completion of her duties now appeared as potential complicity in the machinery of genocide. Henry Pritchard watched these women with growing concern. He understood grief, having lost his brother and witnessed his own share of loss during his years farming the unforgiving prairie. But this was different. This was the grief of people discovering that their entire understanding of themselves had been built on lies, that their identity as patriots and servants of their nation had masked participation in something unspeakably evil. One morning he found Waltraud in the equipment shed, staring at the threshing machine she had repaired months earlier. She was crying silently, her capable hands idle at her sides. Henry approached carefully, uncertain what comfort he could possibly offer to someone experiencing such profound moral devastation. In halting English, supplemented by gestures, Waltraud tried to explain. She had maintained equipment throughout the war, taking pride in her mechanical skills and her contribution to keeping Germany's infrastructure functioning. Now, she understood that her skills had served a system designed for mass murder. Every machine she had fixed, every efficiency she had created, had potentially enabled atrocities she had never imagined. Henry listened, then did something that surprised both of them. He handed her a wrench and gestured at the farm's small tractor, which needed repair before spring planting. "You can't change what you did then," he said quietly, "but you can choose what you do now. Fix this machine to help grow food that feeds people. That's honest work." The simplicity of the proposition offered Waltraud something she desperately needed, a framework for moving forward that acknowledged guilt without demanding complete paralysis. She took the wrench with trembling hands and began to work, finding in the familiar logic of mechanical repair a small island of purpose in an ocean of moral chaos. Similar moments of quiet redemption played out across the farm. Bridget threw herself into helping Mabel with nursing tasks, caring for Louis when he developed a winter fever with an intensity that seemed to channel her need to heal rather than harm. Dorothea organized the farm's record-keeping with meticulous care, finding meaning in creating order from chaos. Irmgard began teaching Pearl and Louis basic German, discovering that education could be an act of building bridges rather than maintaining divisions. The work was not therapy, not absolution, not forgetting. But it was something, a small beginning of learning to live with knowledge that could never be unknown. Spring arrived with the sudden intensity characteristic of prairie weather, transforming the landscape almost overnight from frozen white to muddy brown to the first hints of green. With the changing season came new orders from military command. The war in Europe was approaching its end, and plans for prisoner repatriation were being developed. The German women at the Pritchard farm would need to make decisions about their futures. Captain Weatherby delivered the information with his characteristic formal precision, but everyone could see the conflict in his face. These women were no longer the same prisoners who had arrived 8 months earlier. They had been transformed by revelations about their country, by unexpected kindness from supposed enemies, and by the simple human connections formed through daily proximity and shared work. The women were given 3 options. They could request immediate repatriation to Germany once hostilities ceased, returning to whatever remained of their former lives. They could remain in prisoner status for an indefinite period, housed in permanent internment facilities, while authorities determined long-term policies, or they could apply for displaced person status, acknowledging that they had no certain home to return to and seeking permission to remain in Canada as immigrants. Each option carried impossible complications. Returning to Germany meant facing devastation, potential prosecution, and the moral weight of confronting what their nation had done. Remaining as prisoners meant continued captivity without purpose or future. Applying for immigrant status meant abandoning their homeland, choosing exile over return, and accepting that they would likely never see their families again. The women gathered in the bunkhouse to discuss their choices, speaking in rapid German that reflected the complexity of emotions they were processing. Anneliese found herself unexpectedly conflicted. 8 months earlier, she would have chosen immediate repatriation without hesitation. Germany was her home, her identity, the source of everything she understood about herself. But that Germany no longer existed, if it ever truly had. Bridget spoke about her mother's letters, which had explicitly begged her to find some way to remain wherever she was. Return to what, her mother had written. There is nothing here but rubble and grief. If you have found safety and purpose, stay there. Live the life that your brother cannot. Dorothea raised practical concerns. Even if they wanted to stay, would Canada accept former enemy nationals as immigrants? Would Canadian communities welcome women who had served the regime that had brought such horror to the world? The Pritchard family's kindness was exceptional, but could they expect similar acceptance elsewhere? Waltraud, typically the most pragmatic, surprised everyone by speaking about redemption. "We cannot undo what Germany did," she said quietly. "We cannot bring back the dead or heal the wounds our nation inflicted. But perhaps we can live differently going forward. Perhaps that is the only form of justice we can offer, becoming people who build rather than destroy." The conversation continued late into the night, each woman wrestling with questions that had no clear answers, only impossible choices between uncertain futures. May 8, 1945 arrived with news that Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Victory in Europe Day brought celebrations across Canada, but at the Pritchard farm, the atmosphere was subdued and complicated. For the German women, their nation's defeat meant the final destruction of everything they had once believed about their country's strength and destiny. For the Pritchard family, victory brought relief but also uncertainty about what would happen to the 5 women who had become, improbably, part of their daily lives. Captain Weatherby arrived with official paperwork and instructions that seemed to have been written by people who had never encountered a situation quite like this one. The women were to be processed for repatriation through displaced persons camps in Europe. However, given the chaos in occupied Germany and the uncertain conditions for returning prisoners, they had been granted permission to remain in Canada temporarily while applying for formal immigration status if they chose that path. The decision felt both like freedom and like an impossible burden. Anneliese stood in the farmyard holding documents that represented her future and felt paralyzed by the weight of choice. In captivity, decisions had been made for her. She had been told where to go, what to do, how to spend each day. Now she faced genuine freedom, and it terrified her more than imprisonment had. Mabel found her there and recognized the paralysis immediately. "You're afraid of making the wrong choice," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of observed fact. Anneliese nodded, unable to articulate the complexity of her fear. What if she stayed and spent the rest of her life regretting abandoning her mother? What if she returned and discovered that the life she imagined reclaiming had never really existed? Every choice seemed to contain the seeds of profound regret. Mabel's response was characteristically direct. "There is no right choice," she said. "There's only the choice you make and then the life you build from it. You can spend forever trying to figure out which decision would have been better, or you can make a decision and put your energy into making it work." The wisdom was simple but profound. Annalise realized she had been waiting for some clear sign, some obvious indication of the correct path. But moral clarity of that sort was a luxury she no longer possessed. She had to choose based on incomplete information and uncertain outcomes, accepting that she might never know if she had decided wisely. That evening, the 5 German women gathered one final time to share their decisions. Irmgard and Waltraud had chosen to apply for immigration status, acknowledging that returning to Germany held more terror than promise. Dorothea had decided to return, feeling an obligation to her mother and her homeland despite everything. Brigitte remained undecided, torn between her mother's explicit request that she stay and her own deep longing for home. Annalise announced her choice last. She would stay in Canada and apply for immigration. The decision felt both inevitable and impossible, a choice that honored what she had learned while acknowledging that she could never truly escape what she had been. The process of transitioning from prisoner to immigrant proved far more complex than any official documentation had suggested. The women who chose to stay needed sponsors, families, or organizations willing to vouch for their character and provide support during their integration into Canadian society. Given their status as former enemy nationals, finding such sponsors seemed an insurmountable challenge. Henry and Mabel Pritchard surprised everyone, including themselves, by offering to sponsor Annalisa. The decision had not come easily. They spent long evenings discussing the implications, knowing that taking responsibility for a former German soldier would invite judgment from their community. Some neighbors would see it as betrayal, as choosing enemy sympathy over loyalty to the Canadian soldiers still fighting in the Pacific. But Mabel had watched Annalisa's transformation over the past 8 months with careful attention. She had seen genuine remorse, honest reckoning with difficult truths, and a determination to become someone different than who she had been. More importantly, she had come to genuinely care for this young woman who had arrived as an enemy and become something approaching family. The announcement created immediate controversy in the surrounding community. Mrs. Edith Caldwell, the schoolteacher, organized a meeting at the town hall to discuss the Pritchards' decision. Some attendees spoke passionately against allowing former Nazis to remain in Canada, arguing that prisoners should be returned to face justice in their own country. Others, particularly those who had met the German women through church outreach programs, defended their transformation and their right to seek new lives. Father McKinnon spoke with quiet authority about redemption and the Christian obligation to offer second chances to those who genuinely sought them. He reminded the assembled community that Canada itself had been built by people fleeing difficult pasts, seeking opportunities to become something different than circumstances had made them. The debate revealed deep divisions within the community about justice, forgiveness, and national identity. Some families refused to speak to the Pritchards, viewing their sponsorship as a moral failing. Others reached out to offer support, moved by what they saw as an act of courageous compassion. Waltraud found sponsorship through an unexpected source. The owner of an agricultural equipment company in Lethbridge had heard about her mechanical skills and offered both sponsorship and employment. He was a practical man who valued competence over political considerations, and he needed skilled workers more than he needed ideological purity. Irmgard's sponsor came through Father McKinnon's network. A Catholic family in Calgary, originally from Poland, and themselves refugees from European conflicts, offered to take her in. They understood displacement and the need for fresh starts in ways that native-born Canadians often could not. Brigitte, still undecided about staying or returning, watched these arrangements with growing anxiety. The women who had been her companions through capture, imprisonment, and transformation were scattering, each choosing their own path forward. The community that had sustained them through the darkest revelations about their homeland was dissolving into individual futures. On a warm May evening, Brigitte finally made her decision. She would stay, accepting sponsorship from Dr. Harold Chen, a physician in Medicine Hat, who needed nursing assistance and was willing to support her certification in Canadian medical practice. The decision brought relief and sorrow in equal measure. Dorothea's choice to return to Germany created unexpected emotional complexity for everyone involved. She had been the first to establish genuine connection with Mabel, the quiet mediator who helped bridge cultural and linguistic gaps during the early months of captivity. Her decision to leave felt like a rejection of everything the past 8 months had meant, though everyone understood her reasoning. The evening before her departure, the Pritchard family hosted a farewell dinner that felt more like a wake than a celebration. Dorothea sat at the table where she had shared so many meals, surrounded by people who had become improbably dear to her despite the circumstances that had brought them together. She tried to explain her choice in English that had become remarkably fluent over the months. "My mother is alone in Hamburg," she said quietly. "She has lost my father, my brother, her home, everything she built across a lifetime. I cannot abandon her to face that devastation without family. Even if Germany holds nothing for me personally, I cannot choose my own comfort over her need." The moral clarity of her decision was undeniable, yet it highlighted the impossible choices facing all the women. Staying meant potentially abandoning family members who desperately needed support. Returning meant facing a devastated homeland and uncertain future. There was no choice that did not involve profound loss. Mabel gave Dorothea a care package filled with practical items, food, warm clothing, and medicines that were scarce in occupied Germany, but she also included letters of introduction to aid organizations and religious groups that might help Dorothea navigate the chaos of post-war Europe. The gesture was characteristically practical and deeply kind. Pearl cried openly, having grown attached to Dorothea's quiet steadiness. Duncan maintained his teenage composure, but gave Dorothea a carefully carved wooden cross he had made in shop class, a gesture that revealed more emotion than his words could express. Louis simply hugged her and asked when she would come back, unable to comprehend that some goodbyes were permanent. The morning of Dorothea's departure brought Captain Weatherby with official transport. But before she left, something remarkable happened. Several families from town arrived at the Pritchard farm, bringing small gifts and messages of farewell. These were not necessarily people who supported the other women staying, but they recognized the courage in Dorothea's choice to return and face whatever awaited her. Mrs. Caldwell, who had organized opposition to the immigration applications, nevertheless brought a package of teaching materials that Dorothea might use to help rebuild schools in Germany. The gesture acknowledged that reconstruction would require people of goodwill, even former enemies, working toward shared goals of healing and renewal. As Dorothea prepared to board the transport vehicle, she turned to Annalise and the other women who were staying. "Tell the truth about what you learned here," she said in German. "Tell people in Canada what Germany became so they understand why you could not return. But also tell them about the kindness you received so they know that former enemies can become friends." The words carried the weight of a mission, transforming personal choices into something larger. The women who stayed would serve as witnesses to both horror and hope, living proof that people could transcend the hatreds that nations imposed upon them. The summer of 1945 brought both the end of the war in the Pacific and the beginning of genuinely new lives for the 3 women who remained connected to the Pritchard farm. Annalise moved into a small room in the Pritchard house itself, transitioning from prisoner to something approaching adopted family member. The change in status felt both liberating and deeply strange. Her days developed new rhythms that had nothing to do with captivity or military service. She helped Mabel with household tasks, worked alongside Henry during planting season, and began taking English lessons from Mrs. Caldwell, who had softened her initial opposition after witnessing Annalise's genuine efforts at integration. The lessons went beyond language to encompass Canadian history, culture, and the unwritten rules of small-town prairie life. Waltraud thrived in her position. At the equipment company, her mechanical skills earning respect that transcended her nationality. Her employer, Mr. James Richardson, was impressed by her knowledge and her work ethic. Within months, she had become indispensable to his operation, training other workers and solving problems that had plagued the business for years. But success brought its own complications. Some customers refused to work with a company that employed a former German soldier. Richardson lost contracts because of his decision to sponsor Waltraud, economic consequences that he accepted with pragmatic resignation. "He's a businessman who believes in talent over politics," Waltraud wrote to Annalisa. "I worked twice as hard to prove his faith in me was justified." Irmgard's transition proved more difficult. The family in Calgary who sponsored her was kind, but struggled with their own complex feelings about hosting a former enemy. Their extended family included members who had lost loved ones in the war, and holiday gatherings became tense occasions where Irmgard's presence created uncomfortable silences. She found solace in volunteer work at a refugee center, helping newly arrived displaced persons navigate Canadian bureaucracy and language barriers. Her own experience of displacement gave her unique insight into others' struggles, and she discovered unexpected satisfaction in being useful to people even more vulnerable than herself. Brigitte's medical training progressed under Dr. Chen's supervision, but she faced significant obstacles. Some patients refused treatment from a former German nurse, unable to separate her individual competence from her national origins. She endured insults and suspicion with quiet dignity, understanding that trust had to be earned gradually through demonstrated care and skill. The women maintained correspondence with each other and with Dorothea, whose letters from Hamburg painted a picture of devastation beyond what any of them had imagined. She described ruins where neighborhoods had stood, families living in cellars, children orphaned and desperate, a society struggling to find basic subsistence amid complete collapse. But Dorothea also wrote about reconstruction efforts, about people refusing to surrender to despair, about small acts of rebuilding that gave her hope. "I was right to return," she wrote. "This is where I am needed, even though every day is harder than anything I experienced in Canada." Her letters challenged the women who had stayed to articulate their own sense of purpose. 25 years after that September day, when 5 German women arrived at the Pritchard farm, Annalise Hartmann. Pritchard stood in a university lecture hall in Calgary, invited to speak about reconciliation and the possibility of human transformation. She had become a Canadian citizen, married Duncan Pritchard despite initial community scandal, and raised 3 children who knew their mother's history but defined themselves as thoroughly Canadian. Her journey from enemy prisoner to respected community member had not been simple or smooth. There had been years of suspicious glances, whispered comments, and social exclusion. Some people never forgave her German origins or accepted her presence in their community, but gradually, through consistent demonstration of character and commitment to her adopted country, she had earned a place that felt genuinely like belonging. Waltraud had become a successful business owner herself, eventually buying Richardson's equipment company when he retired. Her mechanical expertise and business acumen had transformed the struggling operation into a regional leader. She never married, channeling her energy instead into mentoring young women interested in trades and technical fields. Irmgard had found her calling in social work, dedicating her life to helping refugees and immigrants navigate the challenges of building new lives in unfamiliar places. Her own experience of displacement gave her work an authenticity that no amount of formal training could provide. She established programs that became models for immigrant integration across Western Canada. Brigitte had achieved her dream of becoming a fully certified nurse, eventually serving as head of nursing at Medicine Hat Regional Hospital. Her patient care earned respect that overcame initial prejudice, and she became known for particular compassion toward the most difficult and marginalized patients. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their collective legacy was how their story influenced Canadian attitudes toward immigration and redemption. The women had arrived as enemies and become living proof that people could transcend national hatreds, that transformation was possible when societies were willing to offer genuine opportunities for it. Mabel and Henry Pritchard, now elderly, sat in the audience as Annalisa spoke. They had taken an enormous risk in 1945, offering sponsorship and eventually accepting Annalise into their family. The decision had cost them friendships and business relationships, but it had also enriched their lives in ways they never anticipated, teaching their children that humanity mattered more than nationality. In her speech, Annalisa held up a small leather diary, the same one she had clutched on her first day at the farm. In this diary, she told the audience, "I wrote questions that every person must answer for themselves. Who am I? What do I believe in? What kind of person do I choose to become?" She described arriving at the Pritchard farm expecting cruelty and finding instead a kindness that challenged everything she had been taught. She spoke about the revelations that shattered her understanding of her own country and the difficult work of building a new identity from the ruins of discredited beliefs. "The remarkable thing about Canada," she concluded, "is that it gave me the freedom to discover that I could choose different answers than the ones I had been given. It offered me not just refuge, but the possibility of redemption through honest work and genuine commitment to becoming someone worthy of the trust placed in me." Her story, and the stories of the other women who had made similar journeys, became part of Canada's understanding of itself as a nation built on second chances and the belief that people could transcend their pasts. They had arrived as enemies and become family, proof that even the deepest divisions of war and hatred could be overcome through individual acts of courage, kindness, and the determination to build something better than what had been destroyed.